I've been invited inside the belly of the beast. We've just completed a 1-hour sit-down interview with the head of the real estate industry in Western Australia in their own boardroom in this building behind me. We've been invited in to discuss the real estate industry's response to the news the WA government is ending unfair no grounds evictions in Western Australia. Frankly, I was pleasantly surprised to receive the invitation at all. We've been pretty upfront in our critique of the real estate industry and their position in relation to no grounds evictions in Western Australia, so hats off to them. I reckon there's a lot of politicians out there who could learn from this approach. Invite us in, let's have a full, frank but friendly conversation, discuss our differences and find some common ground, and I think that's what we did. Suzanne, thanks so much for making the time to speak with us. Honestly, a little bit of a surprise that you'd welcome us in. We've sometimes been somewhat at odds with the real estate industry's position on this channel and this platform. Yeah. So I really, genuinely appreciate the opportunity to sort of to talk it out.
Yeah, I think it's good for everyone to get an understanding of everyone's perspective, especially on an issue so emotive as this. Yeah. I think it's really good to reach common ground. Yeah,
great. Okay, speaking of which, on that note then, you had recently said in, I believe it was an opinion piece in the West, that no one needed to worry about a no grounds eviction because you couldn't be evicted no grounds. How do you respond to the government coming out yesterday and announcing that they were abolishing no grounds evictions?
So I think first off, it's really good to understand the terminology and that we're all speaking the same language in relation to that. So there's two different things. Evictions and terminations are two different things. You know, evictions occur once you've obviously breached a lease agreement, whether you haven't paid your rent, and there's a process for that, and then you're taken to court and the court order an eviction of that property. So what the government legislated yesterday, or are proposing, is that there needs to be a ground to terminate a tenancy. And at the moment, that's available in periodic tenancy. So at the end of or during that periodic tenancy, an owner can use a Form 1C, which does have some prescribed grounds, but there is also a 60-day period where they can end that periodic lease by giving no grounds. What the government is proposing now is that there is no natural end to a fixed term lease. So a fixed term lease will continue rolling over until an owner uses one of their new prescribed grounds to end the tenancy.
Okay. What's your position on behalf of the industry? What's your position on the government's announcement yesterday?
Yeah, look, where we do agree, and we've had quite a few meetings with Circle Green just to sort of get their understanding, and definitely the tenant advocate groups, we have no issue about improving outcomes for renters. That is not in debate. Where we're coming from and what our research and our modelling is telling us is that we feel these decisions laid on top of federal taxation changes, on top of increased interest rates, which we're all facing. There's a lot of headwinds coming this way for investors. The median house price has increased, yields are decreasing. On top of it's a really liquid market at the moment. It's a really lucrative time to jump out. So we feel that private investors provide 86.5% of the rental market, and we need to keep every single one of them in. Because the impact of those leaving is, it just impacts tenants with higher rents, lower vacancy rates, and just more pressure.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, you have expressed concern, obviously, about the impact this will have on supply, rental supply, housing supply being the kind of the predominant concern or factor you're seeking to kind of to protect, I suppose. A question that's come up a lot recently in view of this news and the kind of the expectation that it was coming was, what about all the other jurisdictions that have implemented some version of this reform? You know, every other state by now, WA is the final state to enact reforms to rental laws to remove some form of no grounds eviction. In other states, it doesn't appear as though the sky has fallen in as a result. So, I mean, I know you've been asked about this and you've pointed to examples like Victoria, for example, but I mean, Do you maintain that there is concrete evidence of negative impacts to housing supply, to rental supply from these kind of reforms in other jurisdictions?
Well, in answer to that, I would point to the national average vacancy rate of 1.6%. Does that not tell us there is a problem there? And I know the arguments with that. It could be immigration, but a lot of people immigrating, to Perth or other states in Australia also buy. So we can't pinpoint the low vacancy rate just on immigration.
Yeah.
So my concern is we have a 1.6 average.
Yeah.
We have a 2% vacancy rate in Perth, which is trending down. We've come from 2.6, 2.4, 2.2 to now to 2. So that's not heading in a great direction before all these things were announced. And we have record rent prices. So it's not a healthy rental market. And we need, as I said, we really believe we need every single property to stay in the rental pool that we can to help those tenants.
So on that, putting aside questions about whether other states have experienced these trends that you're concerned about, whether West Australia will, just at a purely theoretical level, I'll be honest, I've always struggled to get my head around or to relate entirely to this argument, because if a property investor does get spooked, if for whatever reason, if it's capital gains tax, if it's negative gearing, if it's changes to who they can evict and in what circumstances, if a property investor gets spooked and decides to sell a property, it doesn't just disappear, does it? Presumably it's either bought by another investor, who presumably will choose to rent it in some form, or it's bought by someone to live in. Presumably they've previously been renting. It's not a zero-sum game, surely. It's kind of, what's at the root of this concern? Can you explain why someone selling a property negatively impacts property supply? And
look, speaking to some of the advocacy groups, that's how they feel. That's great. We'll increase supply of properties to buy, and everybody will be able to afford to buy, and they'll all be absorbed by first home buyers or tenants that want to buy. I really dispute that, because we are at a record house price of just hit $900,000 in Perth. We have the 5% deposit scheme, which you need $35,000 deposit at least to get into that at 5%, and already paying record rent of $750 a week. So that's quite unachievable for a lot of people. Are we doing the right thing by pushing young people or first home buyers into a 95% loan when they're facing increased interest rates this year? And the worst situation I feel we could put them in is potentially see some negative equity in their very first home. I think that would be detrimental. We also have women, I come across in my business a lot of women my age who are leaving marriages, who are on a single income, do not have the capacity to ever take on a mortgage and buy a home themselves. We have the elderly who have been long-term renters. They will not be buyers, and we have a lot of young people that, without maybe the bank of mum and dad or help, will not be in a position to buy at a median house price of $900,000. So I would love to say yes, all that, that excess supply stock will be welcome in the market, but I don't think a lot of it will be taken up by tenants.
So you're advocating for more renters, if anything?
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
no, I'm not advocating. I think it's a fact of life. The departments say we've got tenants renting for life, renting longer. It's a growing cohort, and it's actually a growing cohort of voters for them. So I understand, they've got a incentive to look after them.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of the impacts of changes to eviction legislation, there's already quite a few ways that landlords can evict people for grounds, right? Like there's kind of getting close to upwards of a dozen now, especially with the new reasons the government have said they're going to introduce, and
They're proposed, yeah.
Proposed, indeed. But I mean, even with the status quo, the laws as they currently exist, there's a lot of ways that a landlord can evict a tenant if they need to, right? If there's disruptive behaviour or rent arrears or property standards issues, those provisions already exist, don't they? So why is it important to ensure that a landlord can evict someone without using any of the reasons already available to them?
There's not that many reasons at the moment, and sometimes the end of a natural lease is and I say this lightly, the kindest way to end a tenancy or a relationship between an owner and a tenant. What we're going to do now is, because if we've got, let's say consecutive utility bills aren't paid, the court will not evict a tenant for not paying those utility bills. And if we've got consecutive problems with inspection, a court will not evict a tenant because unless there's really severe damage to the property. So we will limp along to the end of the natural term of the lease ends and everybody will part ways, right? And a tenant leaves without a blemish on their record. What we're going to have now is just further tension in a relationship where there shouldn't be tension, because we're talking about a roof over someone's head. It should be a really harmonious relationship and we should be creating a really good environment. Definitely that security and that safety of tenure and so forth for a tenant. What we're going to face is to hit those milestones of what we need for the government to be able to end that tenancy for an owner, is we're going to have to hit tension points all the time of constant breaches. They're going to have potentially 3 strikes. So we're going to have to be on with those. We're going to have to be at loggerheads with the tenant, and then we're going to have to take them to court to facilitate that eviction. So a tenant walks away from the end of that tenancy with a whole lot of breaches under their tenant history and a court eviction. Their name is in that court history.
That's already the case though, right? Because unless a tenant and a landlord harmoniously part ways at the end of a lease, which obviously can still, it happens now and will still happen under these proposed reforms. Well, if a lease reaches if a fixed term lease reaches its end date and the landlord, neither the landlord nor the tenant want to continue the lease, presumably it ceases to operate.
No, and this is the problem. So leases will continue.
So they'll roll into periodics, yes. but either if there's a mutual agreement between landlord and tenant to terminate, there's no tension there. Well, it's only when there's a tenant who wants to remain in the property or a landlord who doesn't want them to stay. If there's a disagreement, there'll be tension. But presumably the status quo with tenants and landlords who both want to end a tenancy, there's still kind of amicable ways to ensure that happens.
Oh, totally. But a lot of times, it's in an owner's interest to keep a good tenant in there long term. Like, it's costly for them to turn over a tenant, and it's not done lightly. And I think we're also talking about putting legislation in for a really small minority of cases. That's my issue too. We just layer, instead of potentially looking at fixing a problem another way, we just layer on more policy, more legislation, which I think it'll be detrimental to tenants. And look, I would love nothing more than in 18 months to be sitting here and go, you know what, we got it wrong. Yeah. Supplies maintained, rents are stabilised, and less tenants are, facing these issues, and the whole experience for a tenant was made a lot better. I would love to be saying that, and I'll be the first one to say we got it wrong.
Do you think it's a done deal at this point? The government's made the announcement. Do you think kind of that's that? Obviously, the legislation hasn't been brought to Parliament, hasn't been passed. No,
it's definitely a done deal, and it will be. We'll spend the rest of the year, hopefully, in constructive consultation with the government about those grounds, so that both sides feel protected and we can reach some common ground. And we can put in sensible reform that will protect both parties and will protect the supply that we're concerned about. And the legislation will come in place around 2027.
Okay, so what does that look like from your perspective? What's REIWA going to be advocating, sort of discussing with the government in terms of those grounds to make sure the reforms are sensible from your side?
Oh, the government have already put in a list, and I think they published that yesterday. But we will do a deep dive into each of those grounds and make sure they're practical, which is really important, because in theory a lot of these ideas and reform make sense on paper, but practically and how it impacts both parties, I think will be really important. And just coming up with some really constructive ideas, and as I said, to make the outcomes really workable for all parties is what we want.
Yeah. Why do you think it's happened now? 2 years ago, the government passed reforms to the Residential Tenancies Act, WA's rental laws, and the the Premier at the time made it very clear that he wasn't willing to consider changing evictions legislation or changing the provisions around evictions to remove no grounds evictions. 2 years later, suddenly the government's decided to make that policy shift, as the ABC I think described it yesterday.
Yeah.
What do you think underpins that change from the government side?
So I think when we first had that discussion a few years ago, we were in a lot worse situation than we are now, and we lost just over 20,000 properties out of the rental pool just after COVID and after the COVID moratorium. So investors did, back up what they said, that they did leave, and that was detrimental. We saw the vacancy rate.
And just to go to that, what was the reason, in your view, for the drop of 20,000 properties, of sort of, a 50% drop effectively in available properties just after COVID?
Oh, a lot of that had to do with, we were sort of one of the only asset classes where a government dictated what you could and couldn't do with your asset. And I think it goes to investor sentiment. And as I said, that's like what we're facing now is all, a whole lot of headwinds of interest rates, taxation changes, policy changes. So I think the sentiment was, oh, well, I am being dictated to what I can and can't do with my property, that loss of control. So I think that played a big part. Obviously, people returning, moving back into their homes, and so there was quite a few things. The change now has definitely been driven by the advocacy groups. I think the community sentiment from them, and I totally understand that, and I totally get that. That's their job. They are advocates for tenants and reform, and that's their sole job, and they did a really good job of it. And we saw in the press release yesterday. Sorry, I thought I muted it. Was that audio okay? Yeah, I think so. I should not call. Sorry.
No, please. If you pick that up, by all means.
So I think we saw yesterday with their policy announcement that we had the Make Renting Fairer advocacy groups stand with the government, and so they should. They're out there fighting for tenants who are paying record rents, facing really challenging conditions. There's a lot of stress out there in the market. So they did their job, and they did it really, really well, and they should stand there, and I know they're all happy with the outcome. And we are just going to really focus on making the reform really fair and equitable and workable for everybody.
Okay. So you've obviously made your position pretty well known, pretty clear, but you've also seemingly kind of resigned to the fact that the government has made its decision. We're in a situation where available rental properties, according to the Anglicare Rentals Snapshot, have dropped from 14,000 or so across WA in 2018 to just sort of hovering around 3,000 across the state today.
Yep.
Right. A precipitous drop, obviously, and at the same time rents have increased by a similar kind of amount. Conversely, what do you think needs to be done to address that situation? If reforms to rental laws aren't the answer from REIWA's perspective, what can be done to address this, acute crisis in the rental market in WA?
Yeah, and what concerns me with that is we've got a very ambitious state government that has, a new 2050 commission, a lot of ambitions, a lot of spending to be done, which needs a huge workforce. And I think we saw an announcement, about $2 billion in that sector, and we need people to build those either infrastructure or homes more desperately than infrastructure. I just really am worried about where we're going to house these people. When you're saying, we've got a 2% vacancy rate, which is trending down, and 2,000 homes available, why are we incentivising people to move into Perth to build these homes, which again, it's a catch-22 because I know we need them. What I'm really disappointed is when I asked the Minister yesterday, there doesn't appear to be, and we'll know Thursday when the budget's released, there doesn't seem to be much or anything in the budget to help tenants with affordability. And to me, that's a critical problem at the moment. We presented which we thought was a sensible option and not a bad idea to the government about whether we could incentivise property owners to pass, if they were to receive a discount on their land tax or the council rates, that incentive went straight to the tenant in the form of a rent reduction to eligible tenants. So we felt that was a really easy, quick way for the government to get some much needed relief to tenants that are doing it tough, especially those that meet their eligibility criteria. And also what we're facing in come July 1, we've got 1,500 tenants coming off the NRAS scheme. So they're renting a property at 20% under market value. Now, surely we're not going to jack up their rent 20% just, because those incentives to owners have gone. So I just am disappointed that there doesn't seem to be much, tangible daily relief to tenants at the moment, rather than punishing landlords or investors with more legislation.
And the extension of the rental relief scheme doesn't fit the bill from your perspective?
It does. There's big gaps in that. Again, in theory, it's helped a lot of people, and in theory, it's a great program. There's still a lot of gaps there for eligibility. We find a lot of in my business, we find a lot of tenants that are elderly will not let themselves get to that stage. They will go without food before they don't pay their rent. They will not let them get themselves into a state where they're in arrears with their rent or facing termination. So they will never see any of that help. Same with some young people, some single people. So there is circumstances where people are abusing the system to get the $5,000, where I see a lot of really eligible, really deserving people missing out on it. So I would like to see that addressed in some form to balance that a bit.
There's also been a lot of focus on youth homelessness and the difficulties of young people getting into the rental market. I mean, there are students, obviously, if you need to grab a glass of water or anything at any point. Sorry, tempted fate. Are there any, obviously it's a very different environment for young people kind of leaving home, going out into the world trying to find not just a home to buy and raise a family, but just somewhere to have their own space, to have somewhere to live when they choose to leave the family home. Are there any measures, instruments that are available that could kind of like make it easier for young people to access homes? when I think about sort of the reports we've seen recently of the number of properties available for a young person kind of on income support, you could count on the fingers of one hand if you're lucky, I think.
Anglicare found one recently, I think.
Yeah.
No, and again, this is probably another concern with the no grounds termination reform. What chance does that give young people with no rental history when owners or investors are now already concerned about ever ending a tenancy? What chance are they going to give 3 young kids that want to move out of home and get their own rental history and move into a rental property? What hope have they got to actually get a start in a tenancy now? Because everybody's going to be so nervous. Those applications are going to be scrutinised, even and further. And the people with, what did I say yesterday? The people with references, what could I say? The tenants with, references that aren't great. They're not going to have much chance getting their next rental property. If let's say that owner wants to sell, or that owner, that's really going to impact them. And I really worry about the young people trying to get a rental history, because one of the best applications we get is somebody that's got a rental history. Same with a credit history, that we can go, right, you've proven yourself, you've paid your rent, you've had good inspections, you've got a great reference from your agent, here you go, here's your next house. That's one of the best examples we can have. So it does concern me that young people will not get that opportunity, because now we've made everyone scared that nobody can be terminated without grounds.
I don't want to dwell on this, but again, is it not the case? Say in the case of a young person who's first year uni, kind of moving out of home, so they've come from the country, or they just want want their own space.
Yeah.
They move into a home with a couple of friends. I've done that myself in the past. You may well have as well yourself.
Yep.
If they have too many parties and the neighbours start complaining, if they have too many parties and one of those parties ends up with the house being trashed and someone puts a hole in the wall or whatever it might be, or there's a broken window, if they can't balance uni and work and fall behind in rent. I mean, all of these things are already covered by existing laws.
The rent is. At the moment, the rent is. You can evict on rent arrears. But it's actually also a 4 to 6 month process. It's not...
just on that. I mean, again, and I'm going purely by what's in the legislation, what's written down. I mean, I have also got fairly extensive experience, as I'm sure you do as well, in the in the courts with these legal proceedings and the way they unfold. And certainly, we all know the courts take their time. It's a 14-day notice period, or indeed a 7-day notice period for breaches of the tenancy under the Act. To terminate a fixed term tenancy with no grounds is 30 days. To terminate a periodic tenancy with no grounds is 60 days. So on paper, it seems like it's actually easier to do it using these existing provisions.
Yeah. So let's take rent arrears, for example. You give the tenant a 14-day notice that their rent is late. It's not paid on that 14th day. On the 15th day, you send them a 7-day termination notice. Let's say they don't go, because generally they've got nowhere to go. It's really hard to find another rental property, as we all know. So they don't move, and a lot of times it's not for not wanting to, it's because they can't find another property, and it's made even harder the fact they're trying to get a reference and they're in rental arrears. Yeah. So then we apply to court for a termination, which takes at least 30 days. So we're already at 7 weeks. Yeah. And then we go to court, and a magistrate will generally not, in the current climate, will not terminate a tenancy forthwith, which again, potentially fair enough, but also that owner has been without any income for that period of time. So they will give a certain period of time to allow the tenant to vacate, and then that tenant may or may not vacate, because they may not again have anywhere to go, and so then it's we have to call the bailiff, and the bailiff again is until recently it was a 4 to 6 week period. So we're over 12, 14 weeks, even if that process goes through that.
It's still the same though, isn't it? If it's a 60-day notice for a periodic, aren't you just adding on an extra 53 days to that process? You've still got to, if the tenant decides not to leave...
We're not having a periodic notice anymore. We're not having a 60-day notice.
No, indeed. All I'm saying though is under the status quo as things currently exist, if a landlord wants to evict a tenant with no grounds provided, they still have to, if the tenant doesn't agree to leave, they still have to go through that same court process. They still have to go to, they've got to lodge a 1C, a Form 12, go to court. A magistrate has to issue a termination notice, vacant possession date. If the tenant still doesn't leave, you've still got that wait for the bailiff. I mean, I suppose all I'm seeking to query is this premise that it's easier to evict someone with no grounds in terms of the administrative or the timing that it takes. Obviously, it's easier if you don't have a good reason to do it. Yeah. If they haven't failed to pay rent or damage the property. It's
easier in a sense. You would just let that relationship end at the end of the natural term of the tenancy when it comes up for expiry. That's not going to be an option anymore. And we feel that maintains the relationship to a point and protects the tenant a little bit.
Yeah, I suppose all I can say is we've seen some no grounds terminations recently, which we've covered, where that relationship certainly hasn't ended smoothly and gently, and there's been a very protracted, very bitter, very tense process because the tenant's got nowhere to go. Yeah. And because they haven't been given a reason why they need to leave. They feel, justifiably or not, they feel that they've done nothing wrong and they're being forced out. And so it kind of, I suppose, I'd simply ask whether the existing system really kind of contains much harmony between tenants and landlords as it is?
I think it does, and I just think with all of these cases, we are talking about a really small minority of people, really small minority of owners that don't do the right thing, and a really small minority of tenants that don't do the right thing. So why are we risking supply right now in the most challenging of markets and putting in legislation that may not really benefit too many people?
Do you accept that it's popular? Do you accept that most people want this, including most landlords?
Is it popular in the way you frame the question? Because I think in the Make Renting Fairer recent polling, their question, and they had 131 landlords respond out of 700 and something survey respondents. 80% or so, somewhere in that vicinity, said we don't believe tenants should be terminated or evicted without grounds. And I think we all agree on that. I think nobody would object to that, I'd hope not.
Yeah.
You know, because it seems quite reasonable.
Yeah.
But I think when you frame it the other way, are you happy for owners to... How can we frame this? I've got to be careful how you use this.
Take your time.
Very clever.
What have we got?
Okay, so we don't. So yeah, asking that question, we have no issue. I think anybody would answer that question. I think if we would ask the question, do you feel if we removed... Hang on, I'm getting caught out now. Help me out, Natalie.
You've probably done your own polling on this issue, right? You've presumably asked your members, etc.
We've asked our members, we've asked investors specifically, and our sample size was 10,000, and we took out bias and a few other parameters around that and got down to 7,700, and 84% did say that it would impact on their decision whether they kept investing in property. And look, once again, we hope people are just saying that and don't actually carry out, that thought. We hope we're wrong, but that's what we've been told.
Okay.
That's pretty hefty modelling. That's a good sample size.
Question arose just before the break about property managers and sort of, advice to landlords. I think there's kind of also been a bit of concern. I've heard concern from within, say, the community sector about the role of property managers in this. Now, you, I think, are a property manager yourself. You represent large numbers of them. I'll put it this way. I've heard allegations from some tenants we've spoken to recently, that they feel that their increased rents, that their evictions, in order to facilitate increased rents, have in some cases been motivated by property managers seeking to increase their commercial margins. Is that something you see happening in the sector? How would you respond to that criticism, I suppose?
Oh, look, once again, I think where, we spoke before, there's a very, very small percentage of potentially troublesome tenants and difficult owners. I no doubt there is potentially some property managers that maybe need more education in that space. I think once again, in theory, it sounds like a really good idea, but practically, the work involved, the sheer volume of work involved, I would not know one property manager that would go through that process of terminating a tenancy, doing a final bond, having the challenges that go along with addressing the final bond, re-advertising the property, meeting 40 people at a home open that are desperate for that property, having them all target you and tell you how desperate they are, and then giving one family that property, and spend your next day ringing 39 people telling them why they didn't get the property, and having the one person that cries, one person that gets it cries, the other 39 people are devastated. To start that whole process again for an extra $50, and your percentage commission on that is $4. I would dispute that. I'm sorry. I get there is owners, see the benefit of extra rent, but also their costs involved. That even their vacancy rate period is at least potentially 2 weeks. They've got advertising costs, they've got leasing fees, they've got final bond inspections. Commercially, it doesn't stack up. We do hear the very small cases that sometimes does happen. The other comment I'll make in defence of property managers, and I appreciate I'm in the industry, there's not much that's enjoyable in the job at the moment. We would much rather work in a balanced market than the market we're currently working in. If your job every day is handing out rent increases when potentially tenants can't afford it, but that's part of your job, your role as keeping that investor-tenant relationship going, and you are turning up at home opens and have one home to house a family where you have 20 or 30 desperate, they're calling you before the home open, they're calling you after the home open to see if the owner's made a decision, and they're devastated when they're missed out. So there's not a lot enjoyable about the job at the moment, and I really feel for those people. They are on the front line, and they're working on the front line in a housing crisis and trying to manage these situations as best as they can.
Yeah. Okay.
You might not have sympathy for property managers. But
No, I don't have to deal with them. As I say, I'm fortunate enough that I rent from a friend of mine. So, yeah, it's all one and the same. It's a complaint you hear more of, which I think probably speaks to the nature of the crisis, the kind of the pressures and the tensions that people are under on both sides.
Yeah, and look, I will say one thing we are seeing, and I did speak to the Commissioner about this, is because she was speaking to me about, we're seeing big rent hikes. Now, we have a duty of care to educate the owner, and it's in our authority, in our code of conduct, to let them know what market rent is. But we also let them understand the value of a good tenant and the cost of moving that tenant on and so forth, so they can make a commercial decision. What we're seeing at the moment with properties that are selling, the investors that are selling and potentially to another investor, like if we take your case, for example, your owner's had a great relationship with you for a long time. He probably keeps the rent at a very fair value. He knows the value that you bring to him and his investment, and he's a very fair landlord. If he suddenly decides to sell his property, and you get a new investor that owns your property who has zero relationship with you, not saying this is right, but this is the reality, has zero relationship with you, doesn't know that you help around the house or you do different things, or you're just a all-round great tenant, but the market value is another $100 a week. They have bought that property as an investment, as a business, on a yield, and they will look to maximise that yield. So unfortunately, that's where we're seeing these examples sometimes. Again, we need the right perspective around it. These examples where rents have jumped dramatically are sometimes, or a lot of times, due to a change of ownership. And the owner is only bringing that property back to current market value, not over and above market value, to the current market value, because that tenant's had the benefit of having that one owner for a long period of time, and they've had the benefit of their owner keeping that rent below market value for that time.
And are you suggesting that that's going to be jeopardised by these changes, that tenants who've had long-standing relationships with their landlords may find that eviction reforms cause those landlords to sell the property to someone else who won't have that relationship?
Well, it's always a risk. Every time we get a property sell out of the rental pool, maybe a long-term investor that is more socially minded, is aware of the social impact, has a long-term tenant, has really valued that relationship, you do jeopardise that. So, yeah.
Presumably, if they've got a good relationship with the tenant, they're not kind of going to be too concerned about whether they can or can't evict them for no reason, per se.
No, they've got no reason to evict them. Have they? The owner's got no reason at all. But when they decide that, you know, and again, it's an education piece, when they decide the legislation, you know, is imbalanced, they might decide it's time to let go of their property, and I think it will be impactful for tenants in not a great way.
Just one question, which may be a bit out of the blue. Is there going to be an avenue where a landlord can still evict a tenant by no grounds, by proxy, simply by increasing the rent by an unrealistic amount? If, for example, a tenant wants a landlord out with no rent caps in place, can they just, you know, unilaterally decide, I'm going to present this tenant with a $400 a week rent increase? It's completely unrealistic, but it's enough that the tenant decides the property's, you know, it's no longer tenable for them.
No. So there's already grounds. There's already avenues in the legislation at the moment for a tenant if they feel the rent is not market value. There's an avenue for them to take that to court and have the magistrate decide. Legislation was put in several years ago that in a longer term agreement, if there was any rent increases, they had to be pre-agreed and it couldn't be CPI or market value, it had to be pre-arranged and pre-agreed, which was great. Everybody knew where they stood, and it was a really manageable transition into a rent increase. And they are looking to strengthen those provisions to stop that. So there will be, I think that's one reforms in one list in the government's reforms, that they will be tightening that up. So that definitely can't happen. No.
All right, reassuring. Final question from me, and it's kind of the question that everyone wants to ask at the moment, and we've touched on it briefly, but immigration. What role is immigration having on WA's rental market, rental sector, and what's your view as the president of the Real Estate Institute about the role? It's a big kettle of fish, I appreciate that, big can of worms to open, but what role does immigration play in the current rental crisis, and what can be done in view of that?
Oh, look, it's a bit naive to say it doesn't have an impact. Of course it does. As I said before, my concern is we do have an ambitious government with a lot in the pipeline to carry out. Most importantly, as I said, for us, that's housing and housing supply. It's a catch-22, isn't it? We need the workers to increase that supply, and those workers have to. My biggest concern seems to be, if we look at the statistics, and I don't know the exact figure, but I've heard it's as potentially as low as 3% of the immigration is only skilled workers. Now, we really need to put some parameters around that we really need to scrutinise all of those people eligible for immigration, that they actually have a skill that can contribute to, to the workforce. I think that's got to be number one. Yeah. I had an example in my business. Had a great property manager. Couple came from Germany. He worked in construction. She became a property manager. Great couple. Really good contributors to society. They volunteered. They were just, as I said, both had jobs, both paid taxes. Their visa came to an end and they had to go home. Now, he was in the construction industry, which seems crazy to me, and they're trying to reapply through another avenue. So, yeah, I think we've still got to get that mix right, definitely.
Yep. Yep. All right. That's it from me. That's a very good question. My thoughts on immigration are that it is naive to pretend that more people coming into the country won't put pressure on an already very tight housing market, and I can well understand why it is becoming the dominant political issue of our time, and I think how the authorities, how the politicians respond to it will define what Australian politics looks like for a long time to come. Suzanne, I really, really appreciate it. It's very, very kind of you to welcome us into REIWA. And yeah, I hope to continue the conversation constructively.
Thank you.